The most powerful moment in one of history's most extraordinary trials was not a dramatic speech. It was one sentence, delivered by an illiterate 19-year-old girl to a room full of 60 trained theologians who had been interrogating her for months, searching for something, anything they could use to legally destroy her. The question they asked was a theological trap with no safe exit. Was she in a state of God's grace?
Answering yes was heresy. No human could claim that certainty. Answering no was a confession of guilt. Either answer ended the same way, in fire. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God so keep me." The court notary later wrote that no one in the room had ever heard a more careful answer given to a more dangerous question. The judges moved on. They had nothing.
To understand how a peasant girl from a farming village ended up in that room, you have to understand what France looked like in 1428. Not the France of history books, the real one. A country that had been shredding itself apart for nearly 100 years in a war it was almost certainly going to lose. The English held the north, including Paris. Their allies, the Burgundians, held the east. What remained of the French military had been pushed south of the Loire River, commanded by a prince named Charles, who was so broke he could not pay his own shoemaker, and whose claim to the throne had been publicly declared illegitimate.
The city of Orléans was the last real obstacle between the English and the complete collapse of southern France. The defenders inside its walls were running out of food. The veteran French commanders had no answers left. They had been watching their armies die under the same English longbowmen who had turned fields at Agincourt 14 years earlier, and the psychological damage was so deep they refused to engage the English in open battle at all.
That was the country a 17-year-old girl named Joan walked into when she crossed several hundred miles of hostile, patrol-riddled territory to demand an audience with a disinherited prince and tell him she was going to save France. She had never trained as a soldier. She could not read or write. She said she had been hearing the voices of saints since she was 13, instructing her to drive the English out and crown Charles king at Reims, the coronation city that sat deep in enemy territory. In any stable era, she would have been turned away at the gate. France in 1429 was not stable. It was a society so close to total collapse that when an illiterate teenager walked in and offered to lead the army, the response was, the theologians gave her weeks of examination, found nothing wrong, and Charles gave her armor and a command banner because they had genuinely run out of other options. When she arrived at Orléans in late April 1429, the siege had already dragged on for 6 months. She didn't come empty-handed. She led a supply convoy of grain and livestock into the city, feeding a garrison that had been eating horses. The professional commanders wanted to be cautious, to wait, to protect what they had. Joan had no patience for it. She went directly to the common soldiers and the city militia, bypassed the aristocratic chain of command entirely, and pushed for immediate, relentless assault on the English fortresses ringing the city. On May 7th, at the main English stronghold blocking the bridge into Orléans, a heavy war arrow drove deep into her shoulder during the assault, between her neck and the steel of her armor. The English cheered. The French assault stalled. The veteran commanders ordered a retreat. She had the arrow pulled out, packed the wound with olive oil, and walked back to the front line the same day. The assault resumed. The fortress fell. The English commander, William Glasdale, drowned in the Loire while fleeing, dragged down by the weight of his own armor. Within days, the English abandoned the entire siege, a 6-month stalemate broken in under 2 weeks. The momentum that followed was stunning. French forces swept down the Loire, crushed an English field army at Patay in June, and marched deep into enemy territory to Reims. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France, with Joan standing beside him. A prince who had no crown, no money, and no army worth the name had inside 3 months become a legitimate king because a teenage girl from Domremy refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. Here is where the story turns brutal. Charles had what he wanted. He wanted to consolidate his position, negotiate with the Burgundians, preserve his new legitimacy. Joan wanted to keep fighting. She pushed for an assault on Paris. The king supplied it with inadequate artillery, no reinforcements, and minimal support. She was wounded again, a crossbow bolt to the thigh, and the assault failed.
Charles officially disbanded the army. She was sidelined, sent to fight minor skirmishes with whatever troops she could scrape together. The court had used her, and now they wanted her out of the picture. In May 1430, defending a town called Compiègne against Burgundian forces, she was dragged from her horse during a rearguard action and captured. The standard procedure for a high-value prisoner was ransom. Charles VII, the man who wore his crown entirely because of the teenagers sitting in a Burgundian dungeon, sent nothing, not a coin, not a letter.
He had rescued France once already. He apparently felt no obligation to return the favor. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 francs. The English understood the problem they had. She had crowned Charles through what the public believed was a direct mandate from God. To invalidate that, they had to prove she wasn't sent by God. The only tool available for that job was a heresy trial. The man they chose to run it was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, and this is the detail that makes the whole thing even darker. Cauchon was not English, he was French.
But Joan had captured Beauvais during her military campaign, which had effectively ended his career and income there. He had his own reasons to want her destroyed. He ran the court, he chose the assessors from clergy known to support the English, and he had already decided the outcome before Joan was ever brought into the room. She was held not in a church prison with female attendants, as canon law required for a female prisoner, but in an English military fortress guarded around the clock by English soldiers. She told the court explicitly that the men had attempted to assault her on multiple occasions, and that she kept her soldiers' clothing tightly laced with dozens of thick cords because a dress would have left her defenseless. She asked to be transferred to a church prison with women guards so she could safely wear a dress. Cauchon refused every time. What followed was 5 months of interrogation. 60 trained theologians and lawyers firing questions for hours at a stretch, searching through 70 original charges that were eventually whittled down to 12 when they couldn't make most of them hold. The English burned her remains twice more after the execution, reducing everything to ash, then threw the ash into the Seine, specifically so no relic could survive that the French might use to inspire future resistance. They were thorough. They were also 19 years too late. The psychological paralysis of France was already gone. The war ground on for another 22 years, and in 1453, the last English army was driven off French soil for good. 20 years after the execution, Charles VII ordered an investigation into the trial. Whether guilt or politics drove him is still debated. By 1456, the Catholic Church had formally overturned the verdict, condemning Cauchon's tribunal as corrupt, politically motivated, and illegitimate. In 1920, the same institution that had burned her declared her a saint. The trial transcripts still exist. 5 copies were made in 1431. 3 survive today in the French National Archives.
They are the most detailed first-person record of any individual life from that entire century. Everything she said is documented. Every trap, every answer, every moment a trained inquisitor tried to break her and couldn't. She was not a saint when she walked into Orléans. She was not a witch when they chained her to a stake in Rouen. She was a teenager from a farming village who looked at a country that had given up, decided that wasn't acceptable, and turned out to be right. Something the men who burned her spent the rest of their lives trying and failing to undo.